Have you ever wondered why some fears feel older than your own memories? Why certain anxieties rise inside you without a clear cause, as if they were whispered into your nervous system long before you were born? Sometimes it feels like you're reacting to something you never lived through, yet your body knows it intimately. A tight chest when things feel uncertain, a quiet guilt when you rest, a sense that safety never quite lasts, and you can't explain why. Here's the unsettling truth most people never stop to consider. You didn't just inherit your eye color or your temperament. You inherited emotional survival strategies, patterns shaped by wars you never fought, hunger you never faced, and fears that were never spoken out loud. Every generation passes something down, not through words, but through nervous systems, silence, and the way love was given or withheld. Picture a person today sitting in a quiet room, phone glowing in their hand, exhausted in ways sleep doesn't fix. They live in the safest era in human history. Food is abundant, violence is statistically lower, comfort is everywhere, and yet inside there's a restless hum, anxiety without a clear threat, pressure without a visible enemy, a constant sense of not being enough. It's strange, isn't it? If life is safer, why does it feel heavier? The answer doesn't live in the present, it lives in the past, buried beneath generations who learned to survive by becoming smaller, tougher, quieter. A great-grandparent who learned that emotions were dangerous during wartime. A grandparent who learned that stability meant silence. A parent who learned love through responsibility rather than tenderness. None of them meant to pass down fear. They passed down what kept them alive. Psychologists call this intergenerational transmission. Neuroscience calls it nervous system inheritance. But emotionally, it feels like carrying a shadow you never chose. A shadow that whispers, stay alert, don't trust too much, don't rest too long. It's the reason peace can feel unfamiliar. The reason stillness can feel uncomfortable. The reason happiness sometimes feels fragile, like it might vanish if you relax your grip. And here's the quiet twist most people never realize. Your reactions today are not flaws. They are adaptations, ancient intelligent responses to a world that once demanded constant vigilance. You are not broken, you are patterned. This journey isn't about history dates or timelines. It's about understanding how human psychology bends under pressure, how fear becomes tradition, and how identity forms around survival. From 1901 to 1980, each generation was shaped by crisis, scarcity, and the need to endure. And whether you know it or not, their emotional fingerprints still live inside you. By the end of the story, you'll begin to see something clearly, not just where your behaviors come from, but why they make sense. And once you see that, you can never unsee it. Have you ever wondered what happens to a child who learns very early on that feeling too much is dangerous? Not because anyone says it out loud, but because the world itself makes it clear. Hunger teaches silence, war teaches obedience, poverty teaches restraint, and in the early 1900s, these lessons were everywhere, woven quietly into childhood like a second skin. Imagine a small child standing in a cold room, watching adults move with tired precision. No time for questions, no space for tears. Love exists, but it is practical, measured in food placed on the table, in work done without complaint. Affection is not withheld out of cruelty, but because survival leaves little room for softness. In that world, emotions are not explored. They are managed, pushed down, hidden away like something fragile that might break everything if exposed. Psychologists now understand that a child's nervous system is shaped not by words, but by atmosphere. The raised voices, the long silences, the constant tension in the air. Attachment theory tells us that when emotional comfort is inconsistent or absent, a child adapts, not by asking for more, but by needing less. The brain learns that safety comes from compliance, not expression, from control, not vulnerability. So children learn to become quiet observers of their own feelings. They learn to swallow fear, to turn sadness into discipline, to mistake endurance for strength. This was the birth of survival psychology, a mindset where emotions were liabilities and resilience meant never needing anyone. The body stayed alert, the mind stayed guarded, and the heart learned to wait. There is a cruel irony here. These children were not unloved. They were loved in the only way their parents knew how. But love without emotional presence becomes instruction instead of connection, and slowly a pattern formed. A generation grew up believing that needing comfort was weakness, that rest had to be earned, that silence was safer than honesty. Neuroscience shows that prolonged stress reshapes the brain, strengthening fear circuits while dulling emotional awareness. Over time, this becomes invisible, normal, even admirable. Society begins to praise stoicism, control, sacrifice. The child who doesn't cry is called strong, the one who suppresses fear is called mature, and no one notices the cost. But something else happens too. That unexpressed emotion doesn't disappear. It waits, like water trapped behind a dam. And when these children grow into adults, they carry that pressure forward, mistaking numbness for stability, distance for dignity. They will become parents one day, providers, protectors, and without realizing it, they will pass on the same lessons they were taught, not through cruelty, but through silence, through the absence of emotional language, through love that works but does not speak. And this is where the story deepens, because what began as survival will soon become inheritance, and the children raised in that quiet tension will begin to feel something strange, a longing they can't name, and a weight they never chose to carry. Have you ever noticed how some people seem unbreakable on the outside, yet strangely unreachable on the inside? As if something essential was sealed away long ago? That mask didn't appear by accident. It was forged in a time when the world didn't reward softness, only survival. By the time this generation reached adulthood, the ground beneath them had already collapsed once. The Great Depression had taught them that security could vanish overnight. Then came war, loss on a scale the human mind was never meant to process, and a daily reality where fear was not a feeling but an atmosphere. Survival was no longer a mindset, it was a routine, and when survival becomes routine, emotions become excess weight. You can imagine them then. Young men learning to hold their breath emotionally, to swallow fear before it reached their faces. Young women learning endurance, learning to carry grief quietly while holding families together. There was no language for trauma, no room for hesitation. Vulnerability was not just impractical, it was dangerous. So they learned the art of the mask. Calm on the surface, chaos buried beneath. Psychology would later explain this as emotional suppression, a trauma response where the nervous system chooses numbness over pain. But to them, it felt like strength. They went to work, built homes, raised children, and carried on as if nothing had happened. Love became an action, not a feeling. Food on the table meant care. Silence meant stability. You didn't talk about fear, you outworked it. And yet, something subtle shifted inside them. When grief is never spoken, it doesn't disappear. It hardens. When fear is never named, it becomes control. Attachment theory tells us that emotional distance often grows not from cruelty, but from necessity. The child who once needed comfort learned instead to become reliable. The adult who once wanted to cry learned instead to endure. This was the great contradiction of the era. Their discipline built nations, their work ethic rebuilt cities, their sacrifice created stability for the next generation. But the cost was invisible. Emotional closeness became unfamiliar. Conversations stayed practical. Affection felt awkward. Even love learned to keep its distance. And so a quiet pattern emerged. Marriages survived, but intimacy thinned. Families functioned, but rarely spoke about what hurt. Strength was praised, sensitivity ignored. The mask became permanent, not because they wanted it, but because removing it felt dangerous. The most haunting part is this: they believed they were protecting their children, and in many ways they did. They provided safety, structure, opportunity, but they also passed down something else, a silence where feelings should have been, a calm that concealed unprocessed pain. Their children would grow up in stability, yes, but they would also inherit a world where emotions had no clear language, and that quiet inheritance would begin to shape a new kind of struggle, one not born of survival, but of absence. Have you ever wondered how a fear can live inside you even when you've never lived the moment that created it? How anxiety can rise in your chest without a memory attached, or why calm sometimes feels unfamiliar, almost unsafe? It's unsettling to realize, but science has quietly confirmed what many people feel deep down. Trauma doesn't always begin with you. Before you ever learn language, before you could name emotions or understand cause and effect, your nervous system was already listening, not to words, but to tone, to tension in the air, to the way a parent's body stiffened under stress or went silent under pressure. Neuroscience shows that infants mirror emotional states through a process called co-regulation. Your brain learned safety or danger not from explanations, but from what it sensed in the people who held you. This is where intergenerational trauma begins, not as a story, but as a pattern, a raised voice, a distant gaze, a touch that comes late or not at all. These moments teach the developing brain what to expect from the world. Attachment theory explains it simply. When emotional needs are met consistently, the nervous system learns trust. When they are ignored or unpredictable, the brain adapts by staying alert, guarded or numb. Not because it wants to, but because it must. Picture a parent who never learned emotional safety themselves. They provide food, shelter, discipline. They do everything right, but when you cry, they freeze. When you seek comfort, they grow uncomfortable. So you learn something subtle and powerful. Feelings must be handled alone. Over time, that lesson becomes automatic. You stop asking. You stop expecting. You become self-sufficient long before you should have to be. Studies on stress hormones like cortisol show that chronic emotional tension in early life can rewire the brain's threat system. The amygdala grows hyper-alert. The body stays ready for danger even when none exists. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to live as if something bad is always about to happen. This is how emotional absence can shape a life as deeply as overt trauma. The haunting part is how invisible it feels. From the outside, everything looks fine, but inside, there's a quiet restlessness, a need to overachieve, a difficulty relaxing into love, a tendency to withdraw when closeness appears. The nervous system, once trained for survival, doesn't easily learn peace. And yet, something begins to shift as time moves forward. By the mid-20th century, a new generation starts to feel the weight of this inheritance. They sense the emotional distance, the unspoken rules, the silence passed down like an heirloom. They begin to question it, push against it, try to name what was never named. But awareness brings tension, because when you start to see the pattern, you also feel its cost. And that's when the real conflict begins, not between people, but within the self. A quiet battle between what you were taught to be and what you're beginning to feel you need to become. Have you ever noticed how rebellion often rises not from chaos, but from silence? How the loudest revolutions are born in homes where nothing was ever said out loud? By the time this generation came of age, the world looked stable on the surface. Yet something inside them felt dangerously unfinished. They had food, roofs, routines, but beneath that order was an emptiness they couldn't name, a hunger that didn't feel physical, yet refused to be ignored. They were the children of restraint. Raised by parents who survived by suppressing emotion, they inherited homes where feelings existed but were never discussed. Love was present but rarely spoken. Pain was real but carefully hidden. And so these children grew up sensing something missing, like a room in the house no one was allowed to enter. The result was a tension that built slowly, quietly, like pressure inside a sealed container. Psychologically, this is what happens when emotional expression is delayed for too long. The nervous system stores unprocessed feeling like energy with nowhere to go. Neuroscience tells us that when emotion isn't integrated, it doesn't disappear. It searches for release, and by the 1950s and 60s, that release came all at once. You can see it in the contrast. On one side, obedience, tradition, duty. On the other, an eruption of color, sound, and defiance. Music grew louder. Rules were questioned. Authority lost its sacredness. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was the shadow finally stepping into the light, a generation trying to feel something real after decades of emotional quiet. Imagine a young adult standing in a crowded room, surrounded by people, music vibrating through their chest, yet feeling strangely alone. They chase intensity because stillness feels unbearable. They flirt with danger, ideas, substances, movements, anything that promises to make them feel alive. Not because they are broken, but because they were raised without a language for their inner world. Psychologists describe this as identity diffusion, a stage where the self hasn't been fully formed because emotional guidance was absent. So the self goes searching. Some find meaning in art or activism, others in rebellion or excess. Some disappear into detachment, wearing irony like armor. Each path is different, but the impulse is the same, to escape the numbness inherited from the past. This era becomes a pressure valve for everything that was never grieved. Grief for wars not mourned, fear never spoken, love never fully expressed. The explosion looked chaotic, but underneath it was something deeply human. A desperate attempt to reconnect with feeling, with purpose, with self. And yet, even as this generation broke rules and rewrote norms, the shadow did not vanish. It only changed form, because when emotion is unleashed without understanding, it can liberate, or it can consume. What emerged from this time would shape the emotional world we live in now. A world more expressive, yet still haunted. A world still trying to reconcile freedom with stability, feeling with control. And as the dust settled, a new question began to form quietly in the background, waiting to be answered by the next generation. Have you ever noticed how exhaustion slowly became a badge of honor? How being busy started to sound like virtue and rest began to feel like guilt? Somewhere along the way, society quietly rewrote the rules of worth, and most people never realized it was happening. By the 1970s, the world had changed its language. Survival was no longer about enduring war or scarcity. Now it was about proving yourself. Success became measurable, productivity became visible, and emotion, once dangerous, became something else entirely: inconvenient. Acceptable only when polished, useful, or hidden behind achievement. You can feel the shift in the way people began to live. A child learns early that praise comes from performance, not presence. Good grades earn attention. Silence earns approval. Strength means handling things alone. Over time, that child becomes an adult who doesn't ask how they feel, only what they've accomplished. Their identity is no longer something they inhabit, but something they build, layer by layer, like armor. Psychology calls this conditional self-worth. Neuroscience shows how reward systems in the brain adapt to external validation, releasing dopamine not from connection or rest, but from achievement. The body learns to chase approval the way it once chased safety, and slowly a new mask forms. Not the mask of silence, but the mask of success. From the outside, everything looks impressive. Careers grow, lives appear stable, smiles are practiced, but inside, something is missing. Emotional needs don't vanish simply because they're ignored. They wait. Like a garden deprived of water, they dry out quietly until nothing feels nourishing anymore. People begin to feel strangely hollow, even when they're winning. Relationships start to reflect this shift. Vulnerability feels risky. Dependence feels weak. Independence becomes a shield. People learn to say, "I'm fine," even when they're exhausted, lonely, or quietly resentful. And because everyone else is doing the same, the performance continues, a culture of smiles masking fatigue, of ambition masking fear. This is where the real contradiction emerges. The more society rewards productivity, the less space it leaves for being human. Emotional expression becomes something you schedule, not something you live. Burnout becomes normal, anxiety becomes background noise, and loneliness grows not from isolation, but from emotional disconnection in crowded rooms. The tragedy is that this pattern looks like progress. It feels like control, but underneath it is the same old survival instinct wearing a modern suit, a nervous system still bracing for threat, now disguised as ambition, a heart still afraid to rest. And so the question begins to surface, quietly at first, then louder with each generation. What happens when an entire culture learns how to perform, but forgets how to feel? Because when emotions are suppressed for too long, they don't disappear, they transform, and what they transform into will define the next chapter of the story. Have you ever wondered why, in a world more connected than ever, you can still feel unbearably alone? Why silence feels louder at night, even with a screen glowing in your hand? There's a strange tension in modern life, a sense that something is wrong, even when everything appears to be fine. And it's not because you're failing, it's because you're carrying more than you realize. Picture the scene. It's late. You're lying in bed, scrolling without purpose, eyes heavy but mind restless. Messages come and go, notifications flicker, yet none of it touches the emptiness underneath. You're not sad exactly, just disconnected, as if you're watching your life through glass. This is the quiet crisis no one talks about, the kind that doesn't scream, but hums endlessly beneath the surface. Psychology tells us that when emotions go unprocessed for too long, they don't vanish, they reorganize. Anxiety becomes the body's default setting. Loneliness settles in even when you're surrounded by people. The nervous system, shaped by generations of emotional restraint, stays on alert as if danger might appear at any moment. And so you learn to stay busy, to stay productive, to stay distracted, because stillness feels like standing too close to something you don't know how to face. You see it in relationships that slowly fade rather than explode. Conversations stay polite, safe, shallow. Intimacy feels risky, not because love is unavailable, but because vulnerability feels unfamiliar. The attachment patterns formed long before you had words now whisper warnings in the background. Don't need too much, don't feel too deeply, don't rely on anyone. The monster within isn't rage or sadness, it's numbness, quietly convincing you that this is just how life is. Neuroscience shows that chronic emotional suppression dulls the brain's reward system. Joy becomes harder to access, meaning feels distant, even success loses its flavor. You may achieve everything you were taught to want, yet feel strangely hollow once you arrive, like a garden watered with discipline but starved of sunlight. And the cruelest part is this: many people blame themselves. They assume they're broken, ungrateful, weak. But what they're experiencing isn't a personal flaw, it's a generational echo, a nervous system still carrying the weight of unspoken grief, inherited resilience, and emotions that were never given space to breathe. This is the emotional inheritance of a world that taught strength before softness, productivity before presence, survival before connection. And now, as the noise grows louder and the emptiness harder to ignore, something inside begins to stir. A quiet realization that this way of living cannot last forever, because eventually every suppressed feeling demands to be seen, and the question is no longer whether this emotional silence will break, but how and what will rise in its place when it finally does. What if healing was never about fixing what's broken, but about finally understanding what was never allowed to exist? What if the pain you carry isn't proof of weakness, but evidence of something unfinished, quietly waiting for your attention? Most people think healing means erasing the past. In truth, it begins the moment you stop running from it. For the first time in generations, you are standing at a rare crossroads. You have language for emotions your ancestors never named. You have awareness where they had endurance. And yet, this awareness can feel overwhelming, like opening a door that has been sealed for decades and realizing how much dust has gathered inside. At first, it's uncomfortable. Old feelings rise, old fears surface, but this discomfort is not danger. It's sensation returning to a place that learned to go numb. Psychology tells us that healing doesn't happen through force. The nervous system doesn't respond to pressure. It responds to safety. Attachment research shows that change occurs not when we push ourselves to be better, but when we allow ourselves to be seen, even in our uncertainty. The moment you pause instead of performing, the moment you feel instead of fleeing, something ancient inside you softens. You might notice it in small moments, choosing to stay present in an uncomfortable conversation instead of shutting down, letting yourself rest without guilt, admitting you don't have all the answers. These moments seem insignificant, but they are radical. They are the quiet rebellion against generations of emotional armor. There is a powerful shift that happens when you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and begin asking, "What happened to me?" Suddenly, shame loosens its grip. The inner critic quiets. You realize you were never broken. You were adapting. Like a garden growing in drought, you learn to conserve. Now, with care, you can begin to grow again. Healing is not dramatic. It doesn't arrive all at once. It unfolds slowly, like light creeping into a dark room. You start to rewrite the stories you tell yourself. You learn to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. You recognize when fear is speaking, and you choose not to let it drive. You build an identity rooted not in survival, but in presence. And perhaps the most profound shift of all is this. You begin to see your parents and their parents not as villains or heroes, but as humans shaped by forces they didn't choose. Compassion replaces resentment. Understanding replaces blame. The chain doesn't break through anger. It loosens through awareness. Because healing doesn't mean becoming softer or weaker. It means becoming whole. It means carrying your history without being controlled by it. And as you learn to live from that place, something remarkable happens. The weight you've been carrying starts to lift. The silence begins to speak differently. And in that space, a final question begins to form. One that will define the future far more than the past ever did. Have you ever stopped to wonder how much of you was chosen? And how much was simply passed down? How many of your fears, your habits, your silences were shaped long before you ever had a chance to decide? It's a haunting thought that parts of your inner world may have been written by hands you never knew, by lives lived under pressures you never faced. And yet, here you are, a living intersection of past and possibility. Every generation inherits more than stories. You inherit nervous systems tuned by history, emotional reflexes formed in survival, beliefs whispered through behavior instead of words. Like an old house built on unseen foundations, you grow up within structures you didn't design. Some keep you safe, others quietly limit how freely you move. The tragedy is not that these structures exist, it's that most people never realize they're standing inside them. You might recognize the pattern in yourself. The way you pull back when closeness feels too intense. The way you overwork when rest feels undeserved. The way silence feels safer than honesty. These aren't personal failures. They are echoes, emotional memories passed forward like heirlooms, wrapped in good intentions and quiet pain. But here's the shift, the moment everything changes. Awareness breaks the spell. Neuroscience tells us that once a pattern becomes conscious, it no longer fully controls us. The brain begins to rewire. The nervous system learns new responses. The story loosens its grip. This is where inheritance becomes choice, where reaction becomes reflection, where you stop living on autopilot and start asking why you feel what you feel. There's a quiet power in realizing that you don't have to carry everything forward. You can honor the past without repeating it. You can respect the sacrifices without reliving the suffering. Healing doesn't mean rejecting where you came from. It means understanding it deeply enough to grow beyond it. Imagine a child watching you someday, not hearing your words, but absorbing your presence, the way you handle stress, the way you treat yourself when you fail, the way you allow emotion instead of fearing it. In that moment, you become the turning point, the place where the pattern softens, where the chain weakens, and this is the truth most people never hear. Freedom doesn't arrive with noise or rebellion. It arrives quietly through awareness, through the courage to sit with discomfort, through the decision to feel rather than flee, through the willingness to become conscious of what once controlled you. You're not responsible for the wounds you inherited, but you are responsible for the ones you choose to carry forward. And in that responsibility lies something extraordinary. The ability to transform history, not by erasing it, but by finally understanding it. Because in the end, understanding yourself is the most powerful inheritance you can ever claim.